Good afternoon. I think I'll just have to talk loudly. I'm Mike Van Dusen, the Executive Vice President of Woodrow Wilson Center, and a hearty welcome to all of you. This is a wonderful occasion for the center. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was very definitely in the Wilsonian mold, a very serious scholar and an extraordinary visionary and policymaker. And I just want to set the stage by saying a couple of things. And I think it is very true, and it can be said in one sentence: there would be no Woodrow Wilson Center today if it were not for Daniel Patrick Moynihan. In the 1960s, he was very close to and involved with the commission created by John Kennedy to figure out the appropriate way to memorialize Woodrow Wilson. For him and for some on the commission, it was a no-brainer. For Wilson, you don't have a statue, you don't have a building, you have a living memorial, a place where policymakers and scholars could come together and hopefully each could learn from the other. Fast forward to the 1990s. There were people in this town that wanted to shut down construction of something called, of this building. Enter Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan and the idea and the concept, call it the Ronald Reagan Building. Construction restarted very quickly. And there was in the legislation for the Woodrow Wilson Center the idea that eventually the Woodrow Wilson Center would be located on Pennsylvania Avenue. Hence you have out here in the plaza Moynihan Place and Woodrow Wilson Plaza. Then when the senator stepped down from the United States Senate, he came here as a senior scholar. We only had one problem with him, and that was that he hated the summer music. He didn't even think it was music. It was out on the plaza. And I guess I'm being very diplomatic the way I put it. He put it in far stronger words to Lee Hamilton several times. Maura, we're very happy to have you here, Maura Moynihan, and I just might say, and I may be saying it not quite correctly, but I believe you had two wishes following your father's death. I think one of them was to see his papers come out, and the second was to see Moynihan Station. Congratulations to you and to Steve. Step one has been done. Now on to Moynihan Station. Thank you again for being here, and have a lovely evening. I'm turning over the floor to Sonia Michelle, who is the director of the U.S. Studies program here. And Steve, congratulations again on the book.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. It's really a very special pleasure to be able to welcome you to this discussion of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a portrait in letters of an American visionary. This is a unique approach to a unique figure in American public life. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was, as you'll hear from our panelists, and as I know many of you know from firsthand experience, was a man who moved from the world of scholarship to the world of public policy. And if those words sound familiar to veterans of other Wilson Center events, it's because we often use them, or very similar ones, to describe the person for whom the center is named. Like Woodrow Wilson, Moynihan went from academia into politics. In Moynihan's case, it was Harvard rather than Princeton. But unlike Woodrow Wilson, after serving in public office for Moynihan 4 terms in the Senate, he returned to academia, joining the faculty at the Maxwell School. In between, however, part of his history became tightly bound up with the history of the Wilson Center, as Mike Van Dusen indicated. And indeed, I think we can safely say that without Moynihan's tireless efforts, we would still be rattling around in the castle, which is this small building on the other side of the mall, or probably not rattling around at all because we'd all be packed in as tight as sardines, instead of thinking and talking and working in the very pleasant and spacious environs of the Ronald Reagan Building. Some of the letters in this collection shed a little bit of light on Moynihan's role in the process of gaining this space for the Wilson Center. And so I wanted to read you just a few excerpts to give you a flavor of the man and how he was able to achieve so much in this as in so many other areas of his life. He said, when he was starting out, he wrote in '68. He wrote a letter to LBJ saying that thanking him for getting started on the Woodrow Wilson Memorial Project. I write to express my deepest appreciation for your having included this proposal in your District of Columbia message. After many long conversations with Doug Cater, who I believe is one of LBJ's aides, I feel I'm perhaps especially alive to your concern with education and the hope that your years in the presidency will be first of all remembered for your achievements in this field. The establishment of a Center for Scholars as a memorial to Woodrow Wilson may well be the crowning achievement of that record. It will be built, and there is hope that it will turn out to be, as our report proposes, an institution that the 22nd century will regard as having influenced the 21st. One recalls that of the four things Jefferson asked to be remembered for on his tomb, one was the founding of the University of Virginia. The founding of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington may turn out to mean as much to you. It is a proposal for which the nation and the world will be in your debt. So the center was established in 1968, as I said, in the castle on the other side of the mall in a very small building. And then later, as plans began to develop for building this building, and which, as Mike indicated, stalled a little bit, Moynihan again weighed in and wrote a letter to Elwood Quesada, who was the chairman of the Pennsylvania Avenue Corporation, pushing him to allow for space for the Wilson Center. He says, a Center for Scholars, as Nat used to say, the Woodrow Wilson Center is to be the first of its kind, a living memorial, not a statue. As Nat used to say, he was the first president not to ride a horse, and there's no alternative to a live memorial. A Center for Scholars for our one scholar president. The Presidential Commission, which made this recommendation, took a chance in the sense that it was willing to forego the glory of a vast pylon or the distinction of taking over Haynes Point. So I believe it was the plan for which I believe was the plan for the Roosevelt Memorial. Make no little plans, gentlemen. We have not worked 12 years to consign the 28th President of the United States to 3 floors, because originally the idea was to put this just on 3 floors. Now we have 5 floors, and we're already still bursting at the seams. And then finally, he wrote a letter to Meg Greenfield, who was editor of the Washington Post editorial page in 1987, and he was really jubilant about the fact that the Wilson Center was, in fact, going to be housed in this building. Dear heart, I know, you've heard it before, in the course of some 26 years as I count, but this time we've got it. Key to Pennsylvania Avenue. The key to Pennsylvania Avenue, the U.S. International Cultural and Trade Center, largest, not highest building in town, giant indoor mall, all-purpose passport and visa services, trading in arms, armors, armadillos. And then he goes on to thank people. He says, all that is lost is the world's oldest parking lot. So we're really, this just gives you, I've only met Senator Moynihan once when I was lobbying him, actually. So I don't know that I got the full sense of his personality, although I think I got a little bit of it. But in any case, a lot of this comes through in this wonderful collection, of this very rich collection, which we're going to hear about in a few minutes. But before I turn it over to the panel, before I introduce our panelists, let me just say that this event has been very generously co-sponsored by the Washington Public Diplomacy Program, which is part of the Maxwell School for Public Policy at Syracuse University. And I'd now like to introduce Michael Schneider, who's director of that program, and who played an instrumental role in the organization of this event. It's been a great pleasure to work with him, so please welcome Michael Schneider.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with an esteemed group of panelists with you. We much appreciate the Wilson Center's interest in this activity. I thought it was natural and appropriate since the senator had been here in the later years of his life. Some of the stories remind me of other stories. People of a certain age, and I'm sorry for those of my younger alums, it's really over 40, remember and have probably had some interaction with the senator. He cut such a wide swath in politics and public affairs, intellectually. I myself met him in 1969, met him again in 1973. I was returning to Delhi after a 2-month tour of India to do a study of public diplomacy, of U.S. public diplomacy in India after 25 years, established right after the independence. I had a wonderful report. I was really juiced up. I was going to tell him all about India and public diplomacy. He thereupon launched on a conversation with me, and he always had younger people with him, by the way. He always had a younger group around him, on the problems of Indian dependent development and Keynesian economics. I sat back. I loved it. It was wonderful. I learned a great deal. I knew he didn't need to have the report spelled out to him. He could read. Again, in years later, when I had retired from the USIA and the State Department and was teaching on the faculty of the Maxwell School, I would bring our students to visit with the senator. And that was really a memorable experience. What an age gap. In some respects, what a culture gap. And he could be, by turns, philosophic, indulgent, puckish, imposing. He would lean across this long, lanky frame, as you can tell from the book and the pictures. He would lean across the table when one of the students would ask him a political question. He'd start poking his finger at them and gesticulating. He left the F word out, by the way. He was good about it. He was really, but he really did become a politician like that instantaneously. And then he would lean back and he would ruminate. Students asked lots of good questions, and he would take a long time to answer the question. He would circle around the question. One idea would lead to another. And I asked one of our students after one of our meetings, "What did you think, Dave?" And he said, "Well, at first I thought it was like a political Jurassic Park." But then as I listened, I gained many, many insights. And I thought that was one of the wonderful aspects that we all loved. I would have liked to think that the senator, at an earlier age, when he joined the faculty in 59, I think it was, Steve, 59, 60, one of the reasons he liked being at the Maxwell School and teaching was that the title of the school is the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. It's a title that's taken seriously. That is, students at all levels, undergraduate, graduate, and all the programs, are encouraged to test their values through study and to learn, to experience, to change, to adapt their values, and obviously to gain knowledge and skills which will prepare them for the modern work world, for their careers. I think that's a blessing for all of us, and it has characterized the Maxwell involvement in our Washington activities over the years. When the project was undertaken, and thanks to Maura and family and Steve, there were contacts made with the Maxwell School, the Dean's Office, Dean Mitchell Wallerstein, and the Associate Dean, Mike Wasilenko. They found funding for the project, and then there was a challenge of finding student research assistants. And we found a wonderful group of talent. I'll just mention their names. Holly Swedlin, who is a graduate student completing her PhD as a visiting student at Yale. Justin Deo, who had returned from the Peace Corps, had been in our undergraduate program here in Washington and served in the Peace Corps for several years, came back. Mia Adamowski, who might be here, I think you are, who worked with them. Chad Brooker, Matt Haggerty, Greg Hirschberger, Ji-Chang Wu from China, Minyan Yin from China, Diana Torres, and Thibaut Delorme, a French exchange student. Very mixed, very diverse group of undergraduates and graduates who helped Steve do the spade work. And I think they made a difference. They contributed to what has turned out to be a marvelous book, full of insights, rich in texture and coverage. I highly recommend reading carefully Steve's essay to introduce it, Maura's recollections and essay toward the end of the book. Turn to the index, pick a subject that you're interested in, follow through. It has gems, pithy comments, interactions. You get a sense of what a rich personality and what a rich impact the senator had. And I only regret for our younger folks that he isn't here, and we need someone like him or her to have the continuity, to have the complexity, to have the understanding of politics and the ability to live with it, at the same time as always holding to the intellectual concepts, the ideas, the principles, the values, and the data. Show me the data was his hallmark, and you can see it. It permeates the conversation in his letters in the book. So thank you again to the Wilson Center and our panelists in advance, and to everyone for joining us. I'm sure we'll have a rich evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Stephen R. Weisman, who is the author, the compiler, and the editor, and in the fullest sense, I mean the annotator. Every letter comes with a little note telling us about how it got there, what it meant, who was involved, and without that, the letters would, which are really so eloquent in themselves, but they become much more meaningful within that framework. Stephen Weisman is editorial director and public policy fellow at the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was the chief economics correspondent, international economics correspondent for the New York Times. He also served as a member of its editorial board, specializing in politics and economics, and as deputy foreign editor. As chief diplomatic correspondent, he won the 2004 Edward Weinthal Prize for his reporting on diplomacy and international affairs. And he's the author of The Great Tax Wars, Lincoln to Wilson, The Fierce Battles Over Money and Power That Transformed the Nation, which received the Sidney Hillman Award in 2003 for the book that most advances the cause of social justice. Please welcome Steve Weisman.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you so much, Mike, and Mike Van Dusen. What an honor to be here at this wonderful institution and to honor both the Wilson Center and, of course, Syracuse University. I got to know the Wilson Center because my wife, Elizabeth Buemiller, was a fellow here writing her book a few years ago. That's when I met Mike and Lee Hamilton and the other wonderful colleagues here. So it's kind of a homecoming to come here. It's just amazing the way life circles back. But of course, Pat Moynihan, if he was an advocate for so many things, but what he was an advocate for was institutions, educational institutions. He was often fighting with the institutions that he loved the most, like Harvard, and that comes to life in these letters. He had a love-hate relationship with Harvard, but he understood their role in society. And I remember when Pat retired from the Senate and came here, I think I was one of the first people to call him here because I knew that this was, and everyone was hoping that this would be a beginning of a new career for him, and it was so sadly cut short before he could write other books and maybe even his memoirs. But what did he leave when he died? Well, he, as you've heard, I just wanted to add one thing apropos of what Mike said, thanking the students. Of course, educational institutions aren't alive without students. And Mia is here, but I just want to tell you what a thrill it was to work with men and women in their 20s, and three of them, two from China, one from France. They weren't that familiar with Pat Moynihan's career. They were from Syracuse, so he's a well-known figure there, and there's a Moynihan Center and all of that, and a Moynihan professorship. But to see them engage in the issues of this letter would have been, I'm positive, one of the most touching and inspiring things for Pat Moynihan himself. And I know that for both Maura and for her mother, Liz Moynihan, who was so instrumental in bringing this project together, they were profoundly moved. This volume helps to take Pat Moynihan to the next generation, and their work convinced me that this book could bring a figure who, admittedly for them, was a figure of history to life, and they were so interested in the issues, especially in the 60s and 70s. So I just wanted to offer a few thoughts. I don't want to go on too long. I'm even more eager to hear from the panelists than you are. When Pat Moynihan died in 2003, as I think several mentioned, he left it was the largest single collection of papers ever given to the Library of Congress. I mean, we're talking about since Benjamin Franklin. And they're spread over more than 3,700 boxes. They take up nearly 1,500 feet of shelf space over at the library and out in Suitland, Maryland. And I actually did the math. That's the equivalent of at least 2 Washington monuments laid end to end. So imagine what my reaction was when Public Affairs Books and the Moynihan family came and said, would you be interested in culling letters and journals from these papers? It was to be overwhelmed. And I know Maura has said that although she wanted to do a book, it was so overwhelming. Well, we did it with the help of so many who have been mentioned. And I can't thank Mike Schneider enough for being my consigliere, my rabbi, and working with the students. But now that the book has been out for a couple of weeks, I just want to talk to you about what my reaction has been to it and how, and you know, I'm still thinking about it. I suppose I always will. This book started out for me, I didn't know how to organize it. I didn't know whether it should be organized by topic or by period of history. But I mean, after my years of journalism, I figured that if I just get started, it'll become clearer to me. And what became clearer is that although it started out as a kind of adventure through the life of a great American and a great American public intellectual, it really led me to a new understanding of American politics and even to a new understanding of where we are today and what we miss about Pat Moynihan. It's no surprise that there was such a vast repository of papers from such a prolific man as Pat Moynihan, and I think, need to go through his extraordinary history as an advisor and cabinet and sub-cabinet member in 4 administrations and serving in the Senate for 4 terms. And he's a man who delivered so many speeches and essays and wrote and edited more than 18 books on so many subjects. So the question I've had to think about is, what do these letters add to our understanding of someone who led such a public life and who wrote from the heart to so many people? What do we learn from these letters to intellectuals and statesmen and fellow politicians and constituents and celebrities, you know, whether or novelists, Alexander Solzhenitsyn or John Updike or Reinhold Niebuhr or Woody Allen or Saul Bellow, or to Brooks Brothers where he complained about the holes in his socks. I think that what I've discovered in the tremendous outpouring that I've encountered to these letters, not just in the reviews, and I'm very lucky to have had great reviews, but just in conversations with people here and in the last couple of weeks, some who knew him, some who didn't know him, that he represents something that has all but disappeared, sadly, and something that we still yearn for, which is a time when disagreement was civil and respectful and even leavened by humor. There are so many wonderful anecdotes, but I've told this one, but I'm going to tell it again. Maura tells it too, you know, that when he first ran for Senate against James Buckley, Buckley tried to denigrate him by referring to him as Professor Moynihan. And Moynihan replied, "The mudslinging has begun." I'm often asked, why did Pat Moynihan write letters? What was he doing? And I've even discussed this with Maura and Liz. I think he used his letters to process his thinking. The expression you've heard is that he lived out loud. I know Maura and Liz have said, Liz has said to me, I never had to read any of his books because I heard them all in conversations. And I think he used his letters in the same way, to process his own thinking. He used them as memos that he could refer back to for his own writings and speeches. He enjoyed writing. I think he loved the idea of sitting down and banging away on that Smith Corona at his farmhouse. And he also, I think, and Liz thinks this, he knew that his letters were going to be important to historians. He was an intellectual. He was a professor as well as a politician. So what do we see in these letters? I think that what we see is not, as I tried to say in the introduction, not so much a different Pat Moynihan, but I think what we see is a Moynihan more personally anguished about his controversies, perhaps more self-absorbed, I think more vulnerable, more filled with a sense of pride and grievance than you might have supposed. And I think another discovery that was reading his early diaries and seeing more about his troubled, complicated relationship with his parents and the pain he suffered when his own family was abandoned by his father when young Pat was 10, and he never saw him again. And Pat never, or almost never, talked about his upbringing in public. But he did in his diaries. Of course, they are diaries. I don't know, I can't be positive that he expected them to become public, and we didn't, we published them discreetly. But he talks about his overwhelming emotions about his mother and father. He talks about the disappointments that they subjected him to. He talked about his emotional attachment to father substitutes and his fear of rejection from them. And I don't want to dwell on it too much, but one thing that really struck me, I'm reading these letters about his father and the broken family, and it just suddenly occurred to me that it was only a dozen years after he wrote that letter as a young man in his 20s that he was writing Lyndon Johnson a memo saying, "You were born poor," he tells Johnson. "You were brought up poor. You came of age full of ambition, energy, and ability because your mother and father gave it to you. The richest inheritance any child can have is a stable, loving, disciplined family." And what we see here is Moynihan not only thinking this through and processing it, but obviously talking about something that he never had himself. But I want to take this a little further as I've thought about it. I think this yearning extended to his lifelong devotion to the stability of institutions. And of course, we've just talked about educational institutions, which were besieged in the late 60s and early 70s, and he was in the middle of that. And he defended institutions, and he defended educational institutions. But I think he also understood the fragility and the importance of defending government, the institution of government, and the success of government, and the success of presidents, not just democratic presidents, I don't want to use the formulation, democratic presidents, but Republican presidents, two of whom he served. And there's a great transcription of his comments to the embassy in India when Nixon resigns. And he tells the staff, after they see a film of the Nixon resignation, that it's clear this man committed impeachable offenses, but he reminds them that this man is the third president in a row to be destroyed in office, Kennedy by assassination, Johnson by certainly a war of his own choice, and the opposition to it. But then he says, there is, I think, an institutional dimension which we who are in government, whose concern is with such institutions, who are part of them, ought to be concerned and can usefully consider. Now, I think the letters remind us how hard it is to shore up these institutions in a divisive time. And I come back to the formulation that he thought through and which curiously, and I will never be sure why he did this, but in the last month of his life, he took a phrase or a formulation from the Godkin lectures at Harvard, which were given in the 1980s, and just wrote them down on a piece of paper, which we came across in the files in March of 2003, which was the last month of his life. I mean, was he trying to sum up his life? Did he know that he didn't have long? I don't know. But he wrote down in some 40 years of government work, and you see this on the back of the book, I have learned one thing for certain. As I have put it, the central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself. Thanks to this interaction, we are a better society in nearly all respects than we were. So what lesson was Professor Moynihan trying to teach us there? People have said to me, why, what was the nature of his bipartisanship? And I'm not a psychiatrist, and I don't know whether it derives from these childhood hardships or the way he thought through and roamed widely intellectually. But what's really interesting to me about these comments is not only his understanding about these two contradictory elements of our politics. What's wonderful is that he saw these contradictory strains not as destructive, but as healthy and revitalizing. And I think this is worth remembering right now, at a time when we have these terrible divisions in our society. And no matter what happens next week in the elections, we're headed for a new period of conflict, political conflict. And I think, people say, well, what would Pat Moynihan make of all of this? I think he'd say, well, we better start listening to each other. And we better start seeing the logic of where people who you disagree with are coming from. I think I'm going to cut short a review of some of the issues that we could mention, whether it's Cold War or poverty or race, because I think this audience is familiar with them, where I could trace this set of contradictions. But I come back to what I enjoyed most about this book was the way it took shape before my eyes as a narrative of modern American history of the second half of the 20th century. And another thing that strikes me is that the 60s and 70s, which are in many ways the most divisive period covered in this book, in some ways has receded. Here we are in the Wilson Center, and who is the person who's the number one enemy? I'm sure that everybody in this room was amused that Glenn Beck has now targeted Woodrow Wilson as the villain of the 20th century. But what's interesting about this is that the debate in the right wing in targeting Wilson is bringing us back to some of the debates of the 40s and 50s that were part of Pat Moynihan's formulation when he was a student in London and when he was in politics. It was a time, the 40s and 50s, when the New Deal was still being termed as communist Herbert Hoover was still calling it a communist thing that should be, it was routine for Republicans to call for the repeal of the New Deal, repeal of Social Security. These are Bolshevik ideas. These are communist. Our state is turning into a corrupt, lethargic state where everybody is dependent on the state. And these old debates are now what we're having. And the toxic cultural debates of the 60s and 70s, for those of us who read this book and see them in their immediacy, I think, maybe you disagree, I think they've receded somewhat. I mean, Pat Moynihan in those years was worried about terrorism, but it was Black Panthers and weathermen. And you don't hear that much anymore. We have a black president. We have a spreading movement for gay marriage. We're probably going to have gays in the military before long, and women in positions of unprecedented power. We haven't banished racism and bigotry that were our concerns in the 60s and 70s. But I think it's interesting that they've taken kind of a back seat to these older issues that we see highlighted in the books and that were formative for Pat Moynihan and his politics. In any case, just to sum up, I think that whether we're talking about these cultural issues or these economic issues, Moynihan was somebody who was bipartisan because he understood the tension between demanding the government's work and skepticism about how well government works. That may be the healthiest way to get to the synthesis that we're going to need in the coming year in the new Congress. I think what we learn from this book is that self-examination, he was a professor, on issues that have been with us since the founding of this country, is not only healthy, it's just vital. And that's the lesson that we miss most from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We have three panelists who knew Professor Senator Moynihan, Professor Moynihan, at different points during his life, and have both professional and political and intellectual observations to make, but also can have some personal recollections that they want to share with us. So we'll just go in alphabetical order. First is Sidney Blumenthal, who's currently a fellow at the Center for Law and Security at New York University. He's a columnist for the Guardian of London and was recently Washington bureau chief of Salon.com. He was executive producer of the documentary Taxi to the Dark Side, which won the Oscar for Best Documentary of 2007. And he's the author most recently of The Strange Death of Republican America, and is the author of many other books. Please welcome Sidney Blumenthal.
Thank you. How premature that title was. Delighted to be here at the Wilson Center, one of Pat Moynihan's many creations, not least of all of Pennsylvania Avenue as it now exists. I want to thank the Maxwell School for hosting this event. Delighted to see dear Maura here. And I'd like to thank Steve for editing this invaluable work of history. I'm writing a book now on Lincoln, and this book reminds me of nothing so much as the memoirs and reminiscences of the people of Lincoln's time, who were completely immersed in politics and public life and committed to it. And it has that kind of feel, and also I think it's as lasting. I don't want to review Pat Moynihan's entire career here and give a potted history of it. I think people are familiar with it. I know that there are some longtime Moynihan staffers out here in the audience, and they are better equipped than I to discuss Pat Moynihan. I met him something like 25 years ago as a journalist. You were not wrong to call him a professor. He was not only a source, he was a kind of teacher. And my own son worked as an intern, was a Moynihan staffer in the Senate office, took the famous call from Bob Kerry when the senator, meaning Moynihan, convinced him to vote for the Clinton budget of '93. Bob Kerry yesterday at the event at the Peterson Institute said that he had a long friendship with with Pat. They were very close. And what he did not mention is Pat was often his therapist, too. And he really played a positive role. I want to invoke Pat a little bit, more than anything else. There won't be another one quite like him. He's a generational figure. He's a historical figure. Hell's Kitchen doesn't exist anymore as it did for him. The old Irish middle and working class belongs to the past. And as the poet Robert Frost said at the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, said, "I hope you're more Irish than Harvard." Well, Pat was as much Hell's Kitchen as Cambridge, as Harvard. And I just want to read a bit from a long piece that I wrote, but just a bit, about Senator Moynihan in 1993. It was about the budget, and it ends with an anecdote that appears in Rick Hertzberg's wonderful review, which I hope you'll all read, of this book. The same anecdote appears because both Rick and I were present at a dinner in the Senate dining room that ended with, you'll see, the office, with its subdued lighting and dark wood trim, resembles an upstairs room at the Century Club. The walls are lined with books and with paintings that are small illuminations of New York's past. Over the fireplace hangs a portrait of a man with a gray beard and wistful, sunken eyes. The painting by Robert Henry is of John Butler Yeats, the poet's father, who in his last years lived on West 29th Street in Manhattan. It was exhibited in the famous New York Armory Show of 1913. Propped up on a bookshelf is a framed caricature of Disraeli, a particular hero. Behind the drawing lies a neat stack of 31 honorary university degrees. On the desk, planted in an antique inkwell, are a quill pen and a small American flag, which might be symbols adorning the occupant's personal crest. Across the room is a stand-up writing desk, upon which lies a copy of the latest book by the office's occupant, Pandemonium, Ethnicity and International Politics. This is the lair of Daniel Patrick Moynihan. When he leaves it and takes his place on the floor of the United States Senate, he sits in the back row, in the seat nearest the exit. Ever since he was first elected in 1976, he has been known as a prophet and a gadfly, and has been respected for his prescience and his provocations. Like other senators, he has taken care of the parochial interests of his state, though he grasps the intricacies of his state's history better than his colleagues do theirs, better than his predecessors, and better perhaps than many local historians. He is collegial to a fault, a man of the institution, an adherent of its traditions and byways, yet he has been something of a loner. He operates with a certain detachment. Habitually, he chooses difficult arguments where other politicians, not to mention other intellectuals, would seek a smoother path. His humor, too, challenges one's erudition. No one but Moynihan, while riding one evening in the open subway that runs between the Senate office buildings and the Capitol, with one of Mikhail Gorbachev's advisors in tow, would suddenly leap to his feet, assume the pose of a socialist realist statue, left fist gripping left lapel, right arm outstretched, body leaning forward, jaw set, and cry into the tunnel, "To the Finland station." It is a true anecdote. There are many phases of Moynihan. His problem, if there was a problem, was of the intellectual in politics, and the politician as intellectual. He was, to begin with, the post-New Deal brain truster. He entered the Kennedy administration not trying to bend politics to the intelligentsia, not trying to transform John F. Kennedy into an ideal philosopher king, but to bring ideas to bear in policy making and politics. I believe Pat Moynihan was much misunderstood in the 1960s and 1970s, mischaracterized and pilloried. And he was misunderstood in the 1980s and the 1990s in degrees too. We all know the history. We're familiar with it. We are all students of Moynihaniana. We know the story of how in 1965, when he submitted his famous report, the Moynihan Report, properly titled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, to President Nixon, he was condemned, even as racist. And that chorus rose even higher in 1970. In 1965, that was for President Johnson. In 1970, when he continued to argue for action for the Family Assistance Plan under President Nixon, he became a whipping boy. And a whipping boy for liberals. The irony, the paradox, of course, is that it was Pat Moynihan who was true to liberal values when they were in crisis. After 1968 and in the early 70s, he was among a number of alienated and angry liberals, but he never abandoned liberalism, and he never gave up the word. He never embraced another label. We know the story of how he engaged in some quixotic episodes trying to transform Richard Nixon into Benjamin Disraeli. A failed Pygmalion. He gave Nixon the biography of Disraeli. It was a doomed, reserved reading assignment. But he did play a role in the brighter side of the Nixon administration. If today President Obama were to propose the programs that Richard Nixon proposed that had been designed by Pat Moynihan, he would be seen as certifying that he was a socialist. Because it was Pat Moynihan who urged that there be a set annual stipend for every family as a way to end the cycle of poverty. Then he was elected to the Senate. But when I came in, it was the mid-'80s. That's when I met Pat. And he was then, the Pat Moynihan I encountered, was mustering the liberal tradition in a different way. And no one did it like he did it, and no one got it like he got it. And he went right to the point of what was happening under during the Reagan Revolution. And he wrote a cogent book called Came the Revolution, which is often ignored, but is really one of the crucial works in the Moynihan opus. Because having experienced some of the destructiveness of movements in the 60s and the 70s, he now saw the destructiveness of movements in the 80s, but this time from the right. And he particularly focused on the contributions of one David Stockman, Maura's former babysitter, who had been elevated to the budget director under Reagan. And what Pat understood was that bankrupting the federal government was being done for ideological, political, and economic reasons, and that running up the deficit was a way to paralyze government and prevent needed social investment. Pat was once again the ally of positive government. He gave a hilarious and a brilliant speech at one of the press dinners. What's it called?
Gridiron.
The Gridiron, thank you. In which he delivered a line about David Stockman, which he said, "One day he arrives at Harvard preaching the infallibility of Ho Chi Minh. Next thing you know, he turns up in Washington proclaiming the immutability of the Laffer curve. And Moynihan remained the Wilsonian. When the Iran-Contra scandal broke out, it was Pat, who had always been the adherent and upholder of international law, who spoke out and called it a practice of deception mutated into a policy of deceit. It was Senator Moynihan who was opposed to a rogue foreign policy and understood the value of the rule of law and the dangers of secrecy to democracy. Now, his relationship with President Clinton, who I worked with in the second term, was, I would characterize it as also having its own phases. It was productive, it was fraught and frustrating, and it was finally productive again. The senator was essential in the passage of the budget that, in retrospect, did far more than anyone understood at the time. It was elemental in all of the advances that took place in the 1990s across the board. And Democrats paid a political price in 1994 for passing that budget. And I remember that it passed without a single Republican vote in the House or the Senate, and that in the House, a Congresswoman, Marjorie Margolis, now in a different relationship with the Clinton family, was hooted out of the chamber by the Republicans as she voted for it, as they sang "Goodbye, Marjorie." And it's worthwhile to remember what it takes to pass legislation and to achieve great social change, especially on the eve of yet another midterm election. Let me just say that I thought that Moynihan was caught in the middle on health care during the Clinton period. It was a tragedy of errors on all sides, beyond his powers to remedy. The errors are too numerous to recount, and this is not the place to rehearse them. And they combined with Senator Moynihan's good friend's ambition, Bob Dole's ambition to be president and to decide to become negative and use the filibuster and prevent legislation from coming forward, a strategy that now has been perfected with a vengeance against President Obama. Let me just fast forward. During the health care debate in 1993 and 94, none of the principals involved would have imagined that Hillary would emerge as Pat's successor.
That's for sure.
And when, at least of all, Hillary or Pat. And when Hillary first considered it, her first meeting was with Pat, and she went to see him, and he brought his statistical documents about New York counties and their voting patterns, and she had during the healthcare debate, trying to win his good favor, had shown him her honors thesis at Wellesley, which was a paper on Saul Alinsky. He read it and returned it to her with an A and remarks on it.
It was an A minus.
Yeah, so, you know, she did better with that paper and his grade than on healthcare, but now she was one to run for the Senate. So he went through every county and explained how they all worked and what was required to run as senator from New York. This was not the intellectual. This was the nuts and bolts politician, but who was still the professor. And more than that, he had won 4 terms. He had won 61 of 62 counties in New York State, unprecedented. And on the last, I was present in the Hyatt Hotel, and when President Clinton said to him, when Hillary's victory had been announced, and the president turned to the senator and said, "She would not have won without you," and that's quite true. Pat was to the end, a man of the party. He wasn't a man of movements. He was devoted to institutions. He was a liberal Democrat, and he was both. He was a liberal and he was a Democrat. And what remains to be appreciated is how consistent he was throughout. I'm not sure he realized how consistent he was, and he might have saved himself some trouble if he knew that. But there was no way to know it until you reached the end.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Todd Purdum, who is an award-winning journalist and since 2006 the national editor of Vanity Fair. He spent 23 years at the New York Times in a number of different capacities, starting out as copy boy, ending up as White House correspondent and covering and in the Times Washington bureau covering Senator Moynihan. From 1997 to 2001, he was the Times bureau chief in L.A., and in 2004, with colleagues from the Times, he published A Time of Our Own Choosing, America's War in Iraq. Mr. Purdum is a graduate of Princeton University.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Very nice to be here. I'm mindful that the hour is late, so I don't want to take too much of your time, except to say that I quite agree with Sidney that Senator Moynihan was, first and foremost, a teacher. And I'm reminded of that literally dozens of times a day because I see his face dozens of times a day because his mass card is on our refrigerator with that wonderful David Kennerly picture and the inscription from Yeats, "How many loved your moments of glad grace." I had a special luckiness in getting to know Senator Moynihan when I was the regional beat reporter for local New York, Connecticut, New Jersey delegation. That was my first job in Washington for the Times. And it was a fascinating delegation. Then as now, the Connecticut delegation was Senators Lieberman and Dodd. New Jersey was Bill Bradley and Frank Lautenberg. And New York was Al D'Amato and Senator Moynihan. And Senator Moynihan, who was famous, of course, for taking very good care of the people of New York in the form of projects and pork, or otherwise known as, infrastructure. Also took very good care of the New York reporters. And at least once a month, if I'm remembering correctly, and perhaps more often if there were a lot of things going on, he would invite strictly the New York reporters. That included reporters from the Watertown paper and the Buffalo paper and the Gannett News Service in Westchester to his office, usually in late morning, for a sort of really a running disquisition on whatever was on his mind. And these things could often range widely. So it became my job in 1994, when he was running for re-election to what turned out to be his fourth and final term, to write a profile of him for the Times Magazine. And in doing this, I spent a long couple of days with him, one of which was driving across upstate New York from Binghamton to Buffalo to arrive at the New York State Democratic Convention, where he would receive the uncontested, well, it wasn't entirely uncontested because Al Sharpton was challenging him, but to receive the nomination of the party for his fourth term. And the great part about this was that it involved wandering all over various towns in upstate New York, including Canandaigua and Seneca Falls, where he'd been instrumental in building the museum to women's suffrage. And as part of this trip, I asked him if he could sum up his political philosophy, what his political philosophy really was. And he said to me, "Nothing I want to give a name to. I'm not a socialist and I'm not a libertarian. I was never a Stalinist and I was never a Trotskyite. I guess if I had to say, and I don't have to say, but you asked, it's an avoidance of ideology." He paused, then added acidly, "Which side are you on? If you're not on our side, you're on their side. There's a different there all the time." And that summed him up. He's the only senator I knew in 1994 who had an honored seat at the funerals of both Richard Nixon and Jackie Kennedy. He's the only senator who by that point had published 18 books. He's also the only senator who had the prescience to tell Mary McGrory when she said they'd never laugh again after John F. Kennedy died, "Heavens, Mary, we'll laugh again. We'll just never be young again." The one thing that was slightly terrifying about dealing with Senator Moynihan as a beat reporter, especially later on when I went to cover the White House, is that you knew that if you called him on deadline at 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock in the afternoon and you really needed a terse and cogent and relevant comment to a highly specific question that could have to be rendered at the length of about 120 words in a 750-word article, that you could not count on getting that answer in anything like real time. And you would have to prepare yourself to fend off your editors, to physically wave them away, because Senator Moynihan would be going on. And he was going to get where you wanted him to go eventually, but first you had to have whatever the detour that he wanted to undertake was. And I remember many, many evenings during the healthcare debate when I was covering the regional delegation, and he was vividly defending the interests of the great teaching hospitals of New York, or later on in other aspects of the Clinton administration, when I would just have to just tell the editor, go away, I promise I'll file it, but I can't speed him up. He's taking his own pace. He's taking his own time. When I wrote this magazine piece, it had, for the time, what was considered to be a somewhat frank and extended discussion of Senator Moynihan's reputation as a prodigious drinker. It dealt with this matter factly and said that it never had seemed to have affected his career adversely in any way. But we did have an interview in his wonderful office, which Sidney evoked so beautifully. I loved going to that office. It was full of wonderful things, including a life-size papier-mâché statue of Thomas Jefferson, a sculpture of Thomas Jefferson made by the senator's son, Tim. But it always felt, I mean, Sidney said the Century Club, it always felt to me that you could easily have been in a club or a professor's house at Harvard. It felt very homey and very cozy, and in the winter there was inevitably a fire. So I asked him a whole lot of questions about his reputation for being difficult with the Clintons and his reputation for dragging his feet on health care reform and so forth and so on. And he said, may I put you on a slightly different track? And he walked over to what was literally a 2-foot stack high of honorary degrees. At that point, it had gone up to 38 from 31. And he took out the latest one, which was from... pardon me, I thought I had this queued up. It was from the University of Rochester. And he read the citation. Independent to the bone, he's the vigilant guardian of the nation's well-being. We call to honor Daniel Patrick Moynihan, teacher politician, thinker activist, international homeboy, and pride of New York. So he said, I don't think I've spent my life being denounced, so why should I go around with a hangdog look? He was practically shouting. He was very upset. And then he said, I get along with the people of New York very well. I'm not sitting here. I'm not complaining. Why are you asking me? And then he said, seriously, why go on about being misunderstood? I mean, I'm still here. And so, thanks to this wonderful book and the letters it preserves, so he is still here. And long may he be here.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you for condensing. I'm sure you have plenty more to say, but we do want to give our audience a chance to speak too. But before that, we certainly want to hear from Polly Trottenberg, who is currently Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. She was previously Executive Director of Building America's Future, a nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing about a new era of U.S. investment in infrastructure, not in pork, in infrastructure. Prior to that, Ms. Trottenberg worked in the U.S. Senate for 12 years, most recently as Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Senator Barbara Boxer, and she also worked for two New York Senators, Charles Schuman, and previous to that, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So I'm sure she has some memories to share as well.
Thank you. And wow, this is a very daunting panel to be on, putting it mildly, but I'll take a little solace that even as a mere assistant secretary, so was Senator Moynihan at one time, and he did quite well with it. So in 1996, I was fortunate enough to sweet-talk my way into a job in Senator Moynihan's office, covering transportation, public works, and the environment. I think in large part because as a fellow New Yorker, I was very enthusiastic about building a new train station in the Farley Building. I think that's basically what landed me the job. As I was getting ready to take the job, I heard all the horror stories. that he fired chiefs of staff every year, that he made grown men with Ivy League PhDs cry like babies when he looked at their memos, that if he took an instant dislike to you as a staffer, he'd cut you off and you'd never get a word in edgewise, that he was quirky and persnickety and he would grill you, and finally he would find the thing you didn't know that you were supposed to know. Between the time that I was hired for the job and I actually started, the chief of staff who hired me was fired. Yikes. So I arrived and I discovered, and I know there are many Moynihan staffers here, I discovered the horror stories were a little bit true, but of course working for him was the opportunity and the experience of a lifetime, and just an incomparable life-changing experience. He was all the things that everyone has talked about: a thinker, a master politician, historian, teacher, and one thing I loved from reading this book, it turns out when it comes to Pinder's Corners, he was a bit of a romantic poet as well in his beautiful letters back to the New Yorkers. He had wonderful theories that he went on about Baumol's disease and the iron law of emulation. I can't think of anyone in politics who has grand theories anymore like that. And he was a self-proclaimed Cassandra on many, many issues. Urban America, the collapse of the Soviet Union, you name it. He was very intellectually playful, I have to say, and he did have a wonderful sense of humor. I miss that. I agree with what Liz Moynihan told Maura in the book when 5-year-old Maura asked her mother, what does my father do? And she said, he's a writer. He really was a writer. And, I worked for him doing transportation and public works, areas in which he was tremendously brilliant, and those were sort of throwaway issues for him. I mean, his main focus was healthcare and Social Security and tax policy and foreign relations, and yet he had time to be brilliant in areas that, were sort of not the biggest interest to him. One thing that's mentioned in your book is the Fisk Report. I brought it along. I found an old copy that I got to work on. In August, if you work for Senator Moynihan, you might be lucky enough to help him with the Fisk Report, which was looking at the balance of payments to all 50 states. But he would also write an essay in it, which the staff would help him write. And I dug this one up, and I saw that in this little report, we covered in one summer the interstate system and the federal gas tax, the rise and fall of upstate New York, the debt crisis in New York, the great compromise in the Senate by the founding fathers, all the political science literature on how we could fix the representational imbalance in the Senate, the undercount of the U.S. Census, and the Line Item Veto Act. I got to work on all that, and I was a transportation staffer, so it's pretty fantastic. I would just say, too, one thing people always, are interested in with Moynihan staffer, he was very famous for taking his staff to wonderful lunches, and they really were wonderful lunches. We would go to La Brasserie, a French restaurant right near Capitol Hill, which has since gone out of business. They would love him at that restaurant. The waitresses would fuss and bring wonderful food and terrific wine. He would tell us all the amazing stories, some of which you've heard here, having served for 4 presidents and then worked with and sometimes against 4 others. He would talk about public policy, history, constitutional law, literature, and sometimes gossip, I have to say. When I was working on a big transportation bill as a diligent staffer, I came to one of the lunches armed with my long list of items that I needed marching orders from him. As I started to take the list out, he took a look at it and he went, "Oh, Paul, put that away." And that was that. We spent the rest of the lunch chatting. I never got my marching orders. I gave them to myself, and, it turned out to be okay. The week that Charles Schumer beat Al D'Amato, that was the week that Senator Moynihan announced he wasn't going to run again. And I had the opportunity then to go become Senator Schumer's legislative director. It was not an easy decision because I loved working for Senator Moynihan, but, he was retiring and this was a promotion. So I took the job. Although Senator Moynihan does have a reputation as a formidable boss, Senator Schumer is in a class by himself, I would say. And it's funny, when Senator Moynihan finally did retire, Senator Schumer and Senator Clinton both actually wanted to do the Fisk Report, and they tussled a little bit over it. But the truth is that when August rolled around, the staff in both offices, myself included, were exhausted. And the truth is that Senator Schumer and Senator Clinton were not sitting down in a beautiful little schoolhouse to write and think. They were traveling the state. They were campaigning. They were raising money. They were giving speeches. They were doing press conferences. Sort of, I think, the era of a senator who can write and think like Senator Moynihan was sort of coming to a close, and he would be one who would say, times change, and that's one way I think, times really have changed. And listen, I loved working for Senator Schumer, too. I worked for him for 7 years, and I learned a lot, and he took up many of the things that Senator Moynihan cared about, particularly the train station in New York. And I'm happy to say at USDOT that we have taken up the train station, too. It's a project that's important to us. But for me, this book was a wonderful opportunity to remember the man, and I think you captured him so well. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists for their wonderful recollections and insights into the book and into the senator's life. We now have a few minutes for questions, and also anybody else who would like to share recollections, and I know many of you in the room have some to share. So please wait for the microphone, and when you get it, please identify yourself. Yes, back there. Yeah.
Hi, Jim Robinson, Maxwell 69. You touched upon India and culture, and I just wanted to say both Ambassador Moynihan and his wife were great lovers of Indian culture, art, philosophy, and I think that says a lot about him. He did have this sense of humor. He was a professor. I guess my question is, everybody seems so dismal about the future. How do you get people in politics, and by this I mean staffers also, to get a sense of humor and to get away from ideology? Are we really doomed to never have another Moynihan?
Anybody want to take a stab at
well,
that?
One thing that does come to mind is another way in which I'm reminded of Senator Moynihan almost every day is when I watch MSNBC and see Lawrence O'Donnell's promotional ads for his show. Lawrence was the staff director of the Finance Committee in the middle of the health care debate. And Lawrence doesn't attribute this to Senator Moynihan, but he says in this show, everyone's entitled to his own opinions, but not to his own facts. And that was the mantra that Senator Moynihan said over and over again. And I actually heard President Obama begin using it a little bit last spring and attributing it to Senator Moynihan. I think somehow what we're seeing now is the strange world in which we're living with a dueling sets of facts. And Fox News has done its level best to create an alternative set of red facts and to say we don't need your stinking facts. We have our own facts. And to a lesser degree, MSNBC has countered with its sort of blue facts. And I think it's probably the least happy development of journalism in my lifetime that people can't even agree on the common data. I mean, as it was said earlier, show me the data. And I think if you can agree on the data, then you can argue and still not lose your sense of humor. But if you really believe the other person is lying, it's very hard to keep a sense of humor. And I don't know how we get that back.
We have narratives, not facts, today. I tried to find where Pat Moynihan said that, by the way, and he said it so often, but it's not in any of the letters. I just wanted to say one thing about India, that India was what brought my family close to the Moynihans, because we were going off to India in the 1980s. I was going to be the bureau chief in New Delhi, and so it was obvious. Pat Moynihan was our senator from New York, and everyone said you should go see Pat Moynihan to talk about India. And then Pat said, well, you shouldn't talk to me, you should talk to my wife and daughter. And so we had an uproarious evening that I recount a little in the book, where Elizabeth, my wife, asked him, is it true you were sick all the time? And he said, I was only sick once. It lasted 2.5 years. But to see him engage and take the issues that he cared about, such as ethnic conflict, to a place like India. Well, there is no place like India. Really, I think that was a very pivotal moment in his own development. And, I mean, you can see even in the White House, in Johnson, he was interested in international issues, and he wrote his PhD dissertation on the International Labor Organization. But Nathan Glazer and others have noted how he brought his understanding of ethnic conflict in American cities to the international stage. But I can't answer your question. There's not going to be another Pat Moynihan, but we can only hope that, Todd and I were talking about this on the way over, that there will be some dialogue and conversation in the new Congress that has been missing.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Tony Bullock. Used to be Chief of Staff to Senator Moynihan for the last 4 years in the Senate. And my colleagues, past Chiefs of Staffs, always argue, well, you might have been the longest serving, but he was a pussycat by the time you got him. So I just want to share two quick stories. One to show the Senator's playfulness, which we often encountered in the office. Took me about 11 requests. He used to say, if you come to him with a request, an invitation or a meeting, you say, well, and he would say, no, not going to happen. He said, okay, fine. And then you said, well, why did you say no? Well, you told no. You have to ask me 3 times. On the third time, I say no. Well, Vice President Gore at that time, when I was there, was as you might remember, going to run for president. But Senator Moynihan is fairly loyal to Senator Bradley, who was also interested in running for president. And yet, Vice President Gore is very insistent on the meeting, wanted the senator to come meet with him. And okay, fine, I'll go. So we get up and go, and he said, no, bring my Social Security plan. I said, what plan is it? The 500-page plan. Bring the plan. Oh, that one. So I called Mark Peterson, the staff. What? Tell me about this 500-page. Oh, yeah, I know what that is. Just stay there. I'll bring it over. So he brings it over. It's one-page plan with a ream of copy machine paper underneath it. And so he brings it out with great fanfare at the meeting with the vice president. Now you must advance this plan. Social Security go into the whole thing, everything that needs to be done, and how we're on a trajectory to insolvency, and of course he's right. As we know, you got to do something. We haven't done it yet, but he put this plan in. Gore's face was just, what the heck is this? You want me to read this now? He said, yeah, you can do it. It's only a few pages. But Senator, these are blank. That's the whole point. There's nothing to it. It's all you can do it in one page. It was a lot of fun. Now, another time we were, the mention of India comes to mind. We had to go up to New York, as Senator always went to the annual conventions of the Democratic Party. This one was at some hideous Hilton or Hyatt hotel in Westchester, and I'd helped him write. Always hard to write for him, but you try to take some of the things he wrote and put them into a new package, and had a nice political speech, and it's going to help nominate the candidates for statewide office. And he wasn't up that year, but he was going to be a featured speaker at the convention that morning. All the county leaders are there, the state committee, all the reporters are there, and we're halfway up there, and at that point we had pagers, not BlackBerrys. So I get this page and I call, what's going on? He says, oh, you should tell the senator the Pakistanis just launched the Gowri missile. And I said, what the F is a Gowri missile? He said, oh, he'll know. I said, oh yeah. I said, Lastumbo just called to say that. He said, oh my God, stop the car. What the heck are we talking? Well, he was so concerned about this aggressive posture of the Pakistanis that we literally, he said, we have to go back. But you're giving a speech in 30 minutes, entire political establishment. I said, oh, right you are. I should do the speech. Yes, you should. So he gets up and he, there's all this stuff. I noticed the speech was with me, not with him. This isn't good. He gets up and he says, my friends, do you realize what's happened? You know, he's going this whole speech about the Gowrie Missile. You know, 1,000 completely puzzled faces. I don't know what he's talking about. He went on and on about, you know, this crisis of nuclear engagement in the subcontinent. So it was a typical Moynihan moment. At which point, when he left, all the reporters were then asking me, "What was that? What exactly was going on there?" One last bit of playfulness. He had this penchant for Smith Coronas. You know, computers weren't going to work for Senator Moynihan for reasons that I think we could all appreciate. He had to have a certain brand of Smith Corona. And as staffers, we were all advised to seek out tag sales and find old Smith Coronas, because you had to populate Moynihan's life with the Smith Coronas. You needed one at the apartment, one at the farm, one in the schoolhouse, one in the hideaway, one in the Senate office, and a couple that you know, in each of the district offices. So you needed about 11 working Smith Coronas at the end of the day, and parts for the Smith Coronas. But for some reason, he would get into these weird modes where he was, typewriter's not working, get people in here, need it now. And I go in there, well, of course it's not working. The cord's been cut, right in half. Just the wire's just been cut. Now, why is this happening? You know, we get it fixed, and a couple of weeks later, the thing is not working. We get it done. I just wondered why was he doing this? And to this day, I have no idea. But the cord was constantly cut. So, anyway, he was a wonderful man to work for, and all of us on this, you know, whatever position you were in the staff, didn't matter. You knew you were working for a very special man. And I'm only a little bit way through your book, but it's terrific. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Back here.
Thank you. Well, I'm an undergraduate at Syracuse, and I'm part of the Maxwell in D.C. program. And I did not know Senator Moynihan, but from my perspective, my generation, and as esteemed as my colleagues that I'm in classes with day to day, we seem to have a tunnel vision. We refuse to look back. I try to not have this same tunnel vision, but I see that people around me have this. And how can we provoke this same reverence for history that the senator had? I haven't read the book, I just bought it, but I know a lot about the senator, and I know his deep understanding and appreciation for history, and I think it has taught me a lot about politics. But my colleagues seem to not understand it, and how can we invoke this with my generation? How can I show them the importance?
I think that is a great question, but I will tell you that I think Senator Moynihan was very unique in his sense of history, and it's funny, when I went to work for Senator Schumer, and at one point when he was driving me crazy on something, and I said to him, unlike Senator Moynihan, you have no sense of history about anything that ever happened before you got elected. And he looked at me and he said, yeah. I think we are a political culture now that we're in the now. I mean, now we're in the nanosecond. If you see an article Todd Purdum wrote where he describes how the press corps follows the president now, and he calls them souped up, hyper, tricked out. I mean, that's sort of the pace of our culture. Moynihan was amazing in the sense of history he had, and it wasn't just the history of his own lifetime. It was the history that went back to the founding fathers and before that. That was unique. I don't know how you instill that in folks. That's sort of, I think that came from within him. It was something really special. None of the elected officials I've worked for have that sense of history in them. It's just not really the way politics really works these days.
I think he was a storyteller, and that was the way to understand history. I mean, he was an Irish storyteller. He could just tell a great story, and it was sometimes a shaggy dog story, which is a term that you may not know, but one of my favorite terms, because it's one of my favorite things. A shaggy dog story where it suddenly ends and it has no point, and you realize that the point was the story that you just read and kept reading because it was so interesting. And that was what he wanted to be. And I think it was very touching to see in his diaries that these terribly formative years in England, when he encountered people who were erudite and witty and great storytellers, he even says in his diary, I want to be like that. And he determined to be like that. And I think that, like, what is it? What is it? Which TV or station is it that, you know, where they say "story matters" is one of the slogans
AMC.
for what? Is it AMC? I guess because I watch Mad Men.
Right.
Story matters, and I think that's the way students should approach history, you know, and that's the way I try to do it with my kids.
His mind was full of hot links, though. I mean, he was always, something was always prompting something else. Yeah. And in this 1994 campaign, we were in Canandaigua in upstate New York, and he suddenly took me aside, and he was going to show me something, but he got distracted, and we were really running late, so they pulled him away. 6 years later, without any intervening discussion of this at all, I reviewed a book, a biography of him that had been written by Godfrey Hodgson. I reviewed it in the Times Book Review. I gave it a favorable review, and I got a lovely letter from Senator Moynihan thanking me for the review, and then saying, I feel I've still owed you an answer as to why I pulled you up that street in Canandaigua, New York, 4 years ago, and it was because he wanted to point out the best extant example of Greek Revival architecture in central New York, and you know, 6 years later, without any intervening discussion at all.
David? Yeah. Yeah. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
One other finest hour of Senator Moynihan, not yet senator, was the 1976 service at the UN ambassador fighting off, or failing to fight off, the Zionism as racism resolution, which was later repealed under Clinton. And it was sort of an emblem of his Wilsonian liberal internationalism, I think. But I'm just wondering, Steve, in looking through these letters in that period of his career, it was such a moment of international struggle, and then also as he was probably then sort of thinking about the Senate race, if you saw any hints or insight into his mind during that moment, that crisis.
It's going to take an active discipline for me to give a short answer to that. I recently gave a talk at my synagogue in Washington, which I engineered because I'm head of the speakers program. And so the topic was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Israel, and the Jews, which I thought was a lot better than the Peloponnesian Wars, Israel and the Jews. And that episode, so Pat Moynihan's understanding of an involvement in Judaism and Jews, of course, began in his coming of age in ethnic New York, when we thought of the Jewish vote and the Irish vote and the Italian vote. But according to him, it wasn't until, although he knew Jews all his life and he loved Jews, and he was what used to be called a Philo-Semite until the term was hijacked by the evangelical Christians. I always like to say that when it comes to the evangelical Christians, people say that the definition of a Philo-Semite is an anti-Semite who loves Jews. But I don't think he actually although he knew Jews all his life and he understood anti-Semitism, he didn't really understand anti-Semitism until that moment at the UN. And I must tell you, I mean, this is still an alive episode because a friend gave this book to Henry Kissinger the other day. I don't know if this is being broadcast or anything, but
it is.
It is. And thank you for telling me. And so I don't want to tell tales out of school, but evidently Henry Kissinger is still exercised over the disagreement that he had with Pat Moynihan in that interval where Pat accused the State Department and Kissinger of undercutting him in that moment when he wanted to make it a big issue and stand up. And the State Department and Kissinger evidently felt that he was making too much of it, and that a better approach and a more productive approach would have been to quietly get the thing buried. But Pat was indignant, and he later wrote, when it was repealed in the 1990s, and I think it was repealed in the first Bush administration, not the Clinton administration, he wrote a letter in the book to I forget who, but Larry Tisch or Bob Tisch. Bob Tisch. I didn't understand the Holocaust until the Zionism is racism fight. It's kind of an amazing thing for him to say, but I think it's prompted me to think it through in this way, that although he knew Jews, he didn't really understand that. And then, of course, this was pivotal to his decision to run for the Senate. He said it would be when people accused him of using the issue to engineer himself into the Senate seat, he said it would be dishonorable to do that, and I disavow any interest in the Senate and renounce any interest. And then he was persuaded to change his mind. Anyway, I have to exercise that self-discipline. But do you guys have insight? Sid?
I think that this is a really interesting episode, and it requires more historical investigation, because I think it's about the rivalry between Kissinger and Moynihan, as Steve suggests. You've got, and it's a continuation of, the most vicious kind of politics, academic politics.
Because the stakes are so low.
You have Kissinger and Moynihan are the two great figures from Harvard besides Galbraith, but Galbraith is out of it by then. And Moynihan had been very experienced. He'd already served 2 presidents before Kissinger ever got to work for a president. And Moynihan was very experienced with government. And Kissinger had overweening ambition. And Moynihan knew how also to get close to a president. And Kissinger, I think, thought that he could... Nixon, of course, it's in the book. This is what's good. This is a good thing in the book. Is Nixon very insecure? Wants to have the 2 Harvard guys around him. Kissinger figures that he can get Moynihan under his control by making him UN ambassador. UN ambassador was not a cabinet member then. It was under the State Department when Kissinger also had extended his empire to become Secretary of State. So he thought he'd get Moynihan that way. Moynihan does the whole Zionism is racism episode, which vaults him into national prominence. Before then, he was known among intellectuals and, liberals and conservatives, and he was very well known among readers of the Public Interest and the New Republic and so on. But now he was suddenly an international figure, and he does something Kissinger could never do: run for public office and get elected.
Yeah. And, there's that great moment where he has a diary entry where he's waiting to see Secretary Kissinger. I think he's ambassador. And some secretary of Kissinger says, Mr. Ambassador, would you mind waiting in the anteroom outside, the office? And he writes, so that's it, or something like that. So it's come to that, And he says something rather more coarse that I won't repeat here about the secretary. I was tempted to say, but so it was pretty visceral. It was pretty interesting, and I frankly think that although this book does not print very much of letters to Moynihan as opposed to the ones he sent, but the one from Kissinger is so great, saying, if you choose to believe that I would undercut you in this way, I suppose there is nothing I can do, but I must say how disappointed I am that someone like you would not feel that candor, blah, 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 blah. And Moynihan never bought any of it.
Well, we could go on, I'm sure, telling many, many more stories, and there are many more to tell, but I'm really glad we were able to hear all the ones that you all had to tell, and very much grateful to our panel and to Steve Weisman for bringing us this book and giving us
Thank you very
the
much,
occasion.
Sonia. Thank you.